but our guest speaker is not here yet.
Well, that's just the day before Cascadia Rising.
Yeah. I don't know what we're doing. I don't know that. Because they're having it during the week. I don't know that the hubs are getting very involved.
What is that again, Matt?
Cascadia Rising
Okay.
exercise.
And is that for the city, for the region, for?
Is that still the week of the 13th? I just happened to put that in my calendar, so I have it on a
Yes.
post in there. Okay.
Yeah, June 13th.
Yeah, and I think it's all levels of government, isn't it? It's
Yeah,
pretty much
it's
the whole region.
Region 10, basically Idaho, Washington, Oregon,
Yeah,
Oh.
so state government, National
Yeah.
Guard, FEMA.
military. Yeah, everybody. Hey, Patty,
Hi there.
how you doing?
Daylight saving
Patty.
time. Hi.
How you doing?
All right.
Got all kinds of folks here. Just missing our guest speaker. Ah, and there he is. Welcome, Randy.
Anybody get snow today?
My sister-in-law Incarnation did.
Okay.
Sun here.
Yeah, we did in Wallingford.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was just for about 15 minutes and it didn't stick.
Wow. That's close.
Yeah.
South
Thank
Vashon got
goodness we
some
don't live
snow
in,
or sleet.
thank goodness we don't live in Portland.
Yeah, I saw pictures. That was a lot of snow.
Really.
All right, Randy, are you ready to go?
Guess not.
Oh, just give me 30 seconds here.
Okay, sure. Randy, I'll introduce you in just a second, but I'm going to go ahead and start the meeting. So welcome, everybody. It is Deep Dive on April 12th. It's a Tuesday, and we're going to be talking to Randy Neals about the electrical grid. Cindy is not going to be on the call tonight. Her internet connection is really poor, and she just didn't want to mess with flitting in and out. So it is us. We are being recorded, and I would like to turn it over to Randy Neals. He is a member of ACS and apparently some kind of an electrical grid guru. So take it away. And Randy, I made you co-host. So if you've got slides or any other kinds of technical stuff, you're good to go.
Well, thank you. Let's see if I can make all this technology work here. So let me see, Zoom and share screen. And maybe, got my fingers crossed there. Hopefully you're seeing a slide with blue on it.
Yes.
Now, I figure out where the button is that makes it full screen. Slideshow should do it. Maybe. Fingers. There we go. Okay.
There we go.
Well, a little an engineer joke. What's up, Doc? Of course, and power in electricity is measured in watts, which is a unit of power, and its calculation is a combination of voltage times current in amps, and you get power in watts. So we won't have any hard math in here, but I had to start with the corny engineer joke. So what we wanted to talk about tonight was, where does our power or electricity come from, and do we need a backup? So in our area, with the Seattle context, Seattle City Light has a number of generating stations around that they own, as well as many of us would know about BPA, which is the Bonneville Power Administration, which harnesses the hydroelectricity that's on the Columbia River. This is a little map I took off of Seattle City Light. And one of the unique things is that Seattle City Light owns its own generators, which are the blue dots. In addition, And here in the Northwest, we're blessed with a lot of hydroelectricity. So the little graph on the right-hand side explains where the energy comes from. So all that electricity we have, the coffee maker in the kitchen, 84% of it runs on hydroelectricity, which is the falling of water, which turns a generator. Nuclear, 5%, very minimal, 4% wind. And then we have unspecified, which is always an interesting category, and biogas, which is usually garbage or other things decomposing, and you get methane gas off of it. So then you burn the gas and make electricity. But by and away, the largest thing that we have as a source of electricity is falling water. And of course, falling water doesn't give off any harmful products to the environment, like burning a hydrocarbon does. So hydroelectricity is generally a green source, and primarily the environmental concerns around hydroelectricity are the making of dams and the damming of water and anything that lived in that area where the reservoirs are. But generally speaking, we're not contributing to greenhouse gases. The electrical system is a combination of power plants on the left. Of course, they can be nuclear, natural gas, hydropower, wind farms, or solar. Transmission lines, and you see these throughout the state as you're traveling around. They cross over the mountains to the eastern Washington. And of course, distribution stations. These are a little harder to see in the city because they're not that plentiful in terms of numbers of them. And they kind of just look like a little industrial thing off to the side. And ultimately, we have our houses distributed all over, and increasingly around Seattle and area, we have rooftop solar, which is distributed. So we have centralized generation, which are over on the left of this diagram, power plants. And then we have distributed storage, distributed generation, and ultimately vehicles that are plug-in vehicles. This is a topology map. Of course, it could also be something like was used in psychology for that matter. But it's basically a flat topology of the electrical grid. Now, this is not geographically accurate. It's just simply a diagram to show that in the center, at the very higher voltages of the electrical grid, there are rings, and it's made to be redundant, and it can reroute electrical power from its source to its destination, or from the generation to the load. But the edges of our network, those blue lines that run up and down our streets, are actually a series of radial lines that go outward, many of them not having redundancy. The core of our electricity system, the high tension wires, the transmission lines on those big steel towers, they tend to be organized in rings with redundancy. And then the wires that run down our streets tend to be not having a lot of redundancy. This is a typical substation. Now, the map on the left is Seattle City Lights service area, which is actually quite a bit farther than just the city of Seattle itself. For example, I live in Burien and Shoreline in the north end. Both Burien and Shoreline get their power from Seattle City Light. And then if you're outside of the Seattle City Light area, you're probably served by Puget Sound Energy, PSE, which has the service area outside. The map on the left shows the substations and the names of them within the Seattle City Light area. And you can see that there are some ring structures to the transmission lines that feed those. So for example, starting in the south end at the Creston Nelson station, there's a path that goes up on the right, and there's a path that goes through Duwamish and Delridge. So for example, if something happened to one of those transmission lines, a pole got knocked down or a wire got shorted out, they can disconnect that line from the system, run the traffic, or not the traffic rather, but the electrical power around another line and continue to operate the system. This is also useful because these systems need to have service every few years to make sure everything's operating fine. So they're concurrently maintainable, meaning that they can take one part of the system out of service and go work on it. The right-hand side Well, that's my dog barking in the background. But the right-hand side of the diagram is the Duwamish substation, which is down by the Duwamish River. This is an example of a substation that has the higher powered transmission electricity coming in and lower transmission on the other side. I apologize. I hope my dog is not too loud. This is a transformer station, a historical picture, just to give some size of the transformer station. And this is one of several transformers in that station. This particular one was made in England, and this is from, I believe, the 50s, 1955, was obviously brought in by ship and then transported with heavy moving equipment to get it into the station. I'm sure this has long since been replaced, but the size of these things continues to be large on this sort of scale. This transformer adapts voltage from a higher level down to a lower level. So one of the things about the electricity distribution system is that if you're using high voltages, like 220,000 volts, you can transmit electricity over quite a distance with very little loss. But of course, it's very hard to consume at that high level because you have to have big, tall transmission towers to move it around. So as the electricity gets closer to our house, they use transformers and they reduce the voltage down to lower levels so that the wires on the poles in front of our house may just have a few thousand volts. And then the final transformer adapts it to the voltage levels we use in our house, which are typically 120 volts. And if some of your equipment, like an electric dryer or that sort of thing, might run on 240 volts. So back to that picture of the Duwamish station. On one side of the Duwamish station is the transmission side, and the 230,000 volt lines coming from BPA and the rest of the network come in on that side of the system. There's some transformers in the middle, and the transformers were those big things I showed you that were on the truck being moved in. They sit between the 230,000 volt side of the transformer station and the distribution side on the left. And the distribution voltages used in Seattle are in the 26,000 or 13,000 or 4,000 volt range, depending on how far and whether it's an industrial area or just residential. They have a couple or three different choices they can make. But ultimately, these are the voltages that are on the wires at the top of the electrical poles running around our city. And then there's pole mounted transformers or underground transformers in the downtown core, which adapt these voltages to voltages that we can consume. These are, typical lines running down a street. This example on the right, I mentioned that I live in Burien, south of Lake Burien. And in fact, there's a couple of different so-called feeder routes. Feeders are higher capacity lines that run to a particular neighborhood. So not every neighborhood gets its own substation or switching or transformer station. And when you see the electrical poles having multiple levels of wires on them, and what I mean by multiple levels, in the left picture, you'll see that there's a cross arm on the very top of the pole holding 3 wires. And then down a few feet, there's another cross arm having another 3 wires. And then on the left side of the road, there's actually another set of poles with 2 more cross arms. Each of those cross arms hold 3 wires, and 3 wires constitute a circuit. It's a 3-phase circuit, which is how electricity is distributed. So this is an example of a feeder, several feeders, in fact, that are running down the street. Only one set of these wires is powering the businesses and the homes on this street, but the others are running sort of like an express route to a different neighborhood and will carry current. Of course, the closer you are to the substations, like this example is very near the Duwamish substation. So there are a number of these multi-circuit cross-arm feeder routes leaving the Duwamish substation. And the farther you get away from the substation, the fewer of them you see, of course. But this is how our electricity goes from these substations through our neighborhoods. And of course, we'll drive under these and drive around this stuff for 50 years and never really figure out that it's there, right? It's that stuff just up there as we drive down the street. Now, a couple of things going on recently. Certainly, smart meters on the left have a little radio transmitter in it, and the radio transmitter talks to all the other meters in the neighborhood. And then at various intervals around our city, there are relay boxes up on utility poles, and they will talk on one side of the network at that box to the meters in the neighborhood. So this type of networking is called a mesh network. So there's a mesh network between all of the meters in the neighborhood and these boxes that the Seattle City Light operates. These boxes have a cellular connection and they relay that meter data into Seattle City Light. Now, of course, part of that is just so that they can bill us for how much electricity and they don't have to send someone to read the meter. But there's a benefit that comes from this is that they report quite frequently when there's a power outage. So of course, you probably, like I, the first sign of a power outage, the first thing you want to do is go look at the Seattle City power map and go, when's it going to be back on? Because invariably it just interrupted something like dinner, the dishwasher, TV, and you just want to know when. So those meters actually have a capability that even as the power is going off, they have a little bit of a battery storage in them, and they can send a message that says, oh my goodness, the power just went off. So all of the meters that have been converted to smart meters, and that's most of them at this point, report in electronically over a radio network to Seattle City Light. And typically within 5 or so minutes of power outage, they have a pretty good idea of what area of the city or areas are affected. And I've taken the example of a power outage that affected us a while ago in Burien on the right-hand side. And of course, we see the Seattle City Light service area outlined in black. And in this case, it was the 3 Tree Point area and where I live in Burien that was affected by this outage. But what I wanted to hint to you is when you look at these maps on the Seattle City Light website, you probably have wondered, well, why is it that shape? Why is it not square blocks that are knocked out? Or why does it form this shape? And what's underlying this is the Duwamish substation is in the upper right-hand side of this map, and the outages were in the lower left. And of course, the outages of houses along the way were roughly following those feeder lines that run back to the substation. So there's a set of wires that run from these outage areas all the way back to the substation. And when there's an outage, for safety and other reasons, breakers open at the substation and shut off the zone. And the zone is not necessarily a square area or specific blocks, but really it runs the directionality of where those feeder lines run out to the neighborhood. So those blue lines on this map are a pair of feeder routes that serve downtown Burien out to 3 Tree Point, and ultimately the areas in red shade were affected this day by an outage. Advancing the slide here. These are an example. In fact, this is right in front of my house. On the very top of this pole is a switch, and you might not recognize it as a switch because it doesn't look like a switch. It just looks like some kind of thing on top of the pole. But what this does is it is a switch that affects all 3 wires, which is typically like one circuit. This switch has a steel handle that comes down the pole, and at the base of the pole, you can see right beside the mailbox on the right-hand side is a handle. And if you unlock the padlock that's on that handle and pull the lever down, it will open up the switch on top of the pole. Now, you might wonder, well, why would you want that? You want the power on all the time. Well, in the case of this particular area, there's a hospital nearby my house, and they like to keep the power on at the hospitals with very little interruption. So in fact, both sides of the feeders that come from Duwamish are in a ring, and they can open up switches around the ring as needed to isolate faults. So if a tree contacted a wire in a certain spot, they can identify the switches on either side of where that tree contacted the wire, open those switches, and then that leaves just that small piece of the electricity network that can't be energized because the tree is still on it. That leaves it dead, but they can restore power to the rest of the network. So if you have a ring and you have 4 or 5 switches around that ring, you can restore power more quickly because, of course, a person just has to drive up to where this handle is on the pole, unlock the switch, and either close it or open it as need be. Really modern electrical grids will even have electric motors that drive this with little battery systems on the pole, and they can use those same kind of radio technologies that we talked about with smart meters to control these switches. And the advantage of doing that is speed. So a central control operator, for example, at Seattle City Light, could look at the system and identify where the fault is, and through a couple of computer commands, they can open and close switches to isolate where that tree fell on the wire, restoring service, to example, for a commercial district or a hospital much quickly. And in Seattle, we find those types of things in the downtown core where service to an individual building is very, very critical because thousands of people depend on it. And it's more automation in those bigger areas. I'll just take a little diversion here and talk about cybersecurity. So in a place where you have a lot of these automated control systems, it's important that the only company operating those controls is the grid company that's supposed to be running it, like Seattle City Light. And it's obvious that in the time that we're in right now with the conflict in Ukraine and Russia, obviously one of the ways that you could very seriously disrupt the country is by hacking into the electrical grid and controlling those switches remotely in a nefarious way. So when you hear people talk about cybersecurity of the electrical grid, this is what they mean. It's the control systems that control very big switches and very big generators and can make either power in your neighborhood work or not work. And when used by the electrical company, that's all good. But of course, if those systems were not secure and allowed for nefarious hackers to get in, they could, of course, not only disrupt the power, but they could make the computer systems that control the grid perhaps self-destruct so that it couldn't be turned on. So cybersecurity of our electrical grid system is very much a thing these days. And all the utilities I know in Washington get help from the Washington Military Department, which is part of the state Emergency Operations Center. They get help from the state to ensure that their grid control systems are secure and that best practices are followed. I'll just continue on. So tree lovers argue Seattle City Light cutting too aggressively. But of course, then the other side of that is high winds cause widespread damage. And the point here is not to take sides in this debate, but certainly we're a city that has a lot of trees and we love trees. We have aerial electricity lines, meaning that most of our electricity is delivered on poles above ground. And trees are the natural arch enemy of reliable power, because if you let them grow, they will not only contact the lines, but they will just get close enough that in a severe wind event, they will then blow into the lines, shorting them out. So quite a lot of the work that companies like Seattle City Light need to do in maintaining our system is actually cutting away vegetation and keeping it away from the power lines so that when we get one of those stormy events with a lot of wind, that the trees do not contact the electrical grid because, of course, it causes a lot of outages and also safety issues. Trees are never stable in the sense of they don't just stay in one spot forever. Of course, they're constantly growing. They get a little bit longer each year. So it's a constant effort to have a cycle of going around and trimming the trees. And certainly people are always concerned if the tree gets trimmed just a bit too much. But typically they have to trim them enough for 3 to 5 years because the cycle of going around and trimming trees is a continuous one. And to get through all the neighborhoods and back again, you have to cut to a decent amount. So yeah, so trees, the arch enemy of reliable electricity. The other alternative, of course, is to bury the electrical wires below ground. This is very expensive to do. We see this in the downtown core, but then dollar per square foot real estate prices downtown are really huge, and the buildings going up the cost of burying the electricity downtown is a very sensible one, but it would make our already expensive housing just another cost in many of the other areas to try and do this. There are some areas of Seattle where there are underground electricity, and this is a photo from Magnolia. Magnolia is on the western slope towards Puget Sound. It gets a lot of storm weather, strong winds, and obviously it's an area with higher real estate prices. So for whatever reason, I don't know fully the whole history, but parts of Magnolia have underground electricity. And of course, you don't see the poles, you don't see the wires, they're buried underground, and you see these hatches throughout the boulevard, which is where the electricity runs. So reliability of electricity, there's a couple of measurements that are very standard. SAIDI, so System Average Interruption Duration Index, that big long jumble, is basically what an average customer experiences. So customer minutes of interruption divided by the total number of customers on the system. And then system average interruption frequency, which is the number of times basically the average customer gets interrupted. So when you think about this really simplistically, when you have a power outage, you want to know, okay, when it's coming back, that's the duration. But then we also think about power outages in terms of, well, when is the last one? And it's really great when you can't remember when the last one was, because that means it was quite a while ago. But if you have a really terrible electricity system with a lot of interruptions, for example, in November and December, we tend to get a lot of storms here. So if we only looked at those 2 months, we would say we get a lot of interruptions. We have a high frequency of interruptions. But for the rest of the year, when we have that awesome Seattle weather, we don't get too many interruptions. So, you know, we all live in a similar geography and have a kind of an expectation of where our system is, but these numbers are actually international. So if I told you that the USA generally was not one of the higher countries for reliability, you might be surprised at that. But for example, well, Luxembourg is perhaps a unique case, very high reliability, but it's a relatively small place with a lot of buried infrastructure. So a lot of their electricity is below ground. And other countries have a lot of below ground as well. Certainly in the UK, there's a lot of underground electricity. So generally speaking, places with underground electricity and not a lot of rural areas do better in reliability than we do. We don't, this may not surprise you, but it's similar to bridges and other infrastructure. We don't necessarily have the best infrastructure anymore. It's a bit of a delay as I push the slide turning button here. What can you do about it for your house? Well, I think it's very helpful to have internet and Wi-Fi still working in your house. Increasingly, we're using our cell phones with Wi-Fi calling, and you may have a laptop, which of course runs off batteries. And naturally, you want to keep your communications capabilities working. You may want to go check the Seattle City Light page to see when they expect the power to be back on, or maybe you just have to post on the neighborhood app or on Facebook. In any case, a very simple thing that you can do is have a UPS for your Wi-Fi router or cable modem, depending on what type of internet you have. And there are special ones that have long duration batteries for small loads. This particular model is designed to give 4.5 hours of backup for a small load like your cable modem or internet router. And that would keep your Wi-Fi working at home. It would mean that if your mobile phone works on Wi-Fi calling, your mobile phone would continue to have a good service. And your laptop, if it's a battery powered laptop rather than a desktop computer or tablet, you'd still be able to get on the internet. So a modest cost, in this case, $194 on Amazon. There is a special one for network, and it gives a longer runtime than a normal computer UPS. A typical computer UPS is only about a half an hour, and it's because a full desktop computer has more draw, would require a lot more batteries to make it run for a long time. So this is a simple thing you can do. It also has a UPS. It also has a USB port that you can plug your phone in. So if you're just happen to catch your phone at the wrong time, you need to recharge when the power's off, you could also plug this in. of course, my luck with USB ports, it only goes in one way, but it takes at least 3 tries to plug those things in, right? Probably not easier in the dark. This is more of a ham radio context. And in the ham radio context, we might have a radio over on the right-hand side. And normally it would run off of an AC to DC power supply, which is over on the left. So some of our ham radio friends, or maybe even GMRS people, might use one of these power path devices with a battery, and they could have several hours of operation of their ham radio or GMRS radio. Of course, an easy way to do this if you have a portable radio is simply to have a couple of batteries, right? And you've already got battery backup if you've got a regular portable radio. But some of our ham folks would have like a mobile radio that they use in their house at a higher power. And of course, this was talking more to the ham context, but if you don't have to use the high power setting on your ham or GMRS radio, you can obviously make the battery last longer. And this is where things like repeaters that you might have heard some of the folks that talk about GMRS speak about repeaters. A repeater can extend your range so that the portable radio or even a mobile running on a battery can operate at low power. And as a result, those batteries can last for several days. So batteries are good for a few hours. How do we operate for a couple of weeks or a month? Obviously, we get into generators, and some of you may have these at home. This is a Honda example, which makes 2,200 watts. And then, the generator itself is about $1,200. A gallon of gas will run you about 8 hours and give you 550 watts. Obviously takes a little more gas if it's putting out the full power. This particular type of generator is so-called an inverter generator. And the simplistic thing there is that the generator engine will run at the speed necessary to match the load you've put on it. So if you're just running a few light bulbs and a TV, it will idle along. If you're running the furnace fan to keep your gas furnace going, it'll obviously run a little bit harder and it'll use a bit more gas to put out more power. But of course, if the furnace gets up to temperature and stops running, then this thing will idle down. So the inverter generators are both fuel efficient and quiet. They're very good for our kind of urban environment where you don't have this super loud old style generator running, and they're pretty portable. This thing's it's a good lift for one hand, but you can get 2 hands on that handle and move it around. I put mine out in my patio when I need to, and I have a little connection in my garage to hook up the electrical wire, and we can keep our house going. It's surprising. 2,200 watts will run my furnace fan in the furnace, and I can also keep the fridge going. I don't run everything like I have the electricity going, but I can certainly survive and be a little better off with this. And I keep a couple of 5-gallon cans of gasoline in my garage. I guess I better be careful advertising that with the present price of gas. There's always concerns about storing gasoline, and obviously, carcinogenic and all of those things, flammable and whatnot, but it's also just not that stable in the sense that you buy gasoline and it's made up of various parts of hydrocarbons, and the thinner parts, the naphthas and so on, will evaporate over time. So gas that you buy today loses its efficacy over a few months, and in 6 months or a year, it's kind of better if you cycle it through your vehicle and buy fresh gas to keep in your garage. Of course, you also have to worry about carbon monoxide and electrical safety with generators. One of the things that's present in gasoline that we use in our cars is alcohol. So ethanol is a gasoline that also has alcohol in it. And this is fine for our cars. They mix this gasoline with alcohol to have cleaner air. However, for gasoline that will sit around and be used in a generator, the alcohol will absorb water from the air, and the water, of course, is not good. It will phase separate, which means it goes into 2 levels in the gas tank, and the water is typically on the bottom. So your generator sitting in the garage with the ethanol gas in it can separate, and then you go to start your generator up, and it maybe runs for just a little bit and then quits, and you can't get it to go again. And what may have been the cause is the gasoline sitting in the tank for a long time has separated into water and fuel. The water gets sucked into your carburetor, and then of course it just won't run on water. The carburetors on many of the small engines are made from cast aluminum or zinc, and the alcohol can cause corrosion and also will damage some of the types of rubber hoses. So while this ethanol gas is okay for our cars and the cars are made to run on it, many of our small engines, everything from rototillers to outboard motors to generators, may not like that ethanol gas. What you can do is purchase non-ethanol gas, and you'll find this near marinas. I actually buy that for my generator, and I go up to Magnolia to get it. I don't know why, but there's a gas station in Magnolia that has non-ethanol fuel. There's a website that can help you find it. There's also some stabilizers that you can put in fuel to prevent the fuel from evaporating and from being contaminated. So on the left, non-ethanol gas, as I mentioned, is better for small engines, but you can also put storage stabilizers in your gas. And frankly, this is good for your lawnmower or for your snowblower as well. Of course, your snowblower is going to sit, if you have one, with not much use in the summer, and your lawnmower doesn't get much use here in December. So you can stabilize the gasoline that you may have in a can or in your lawnmower itself. And that will mean that when you go to start it next time, it's probably going to start on 1 or 2 pulls versus requiring some, mechanical look to drain out the fuel or clean the carburetor. There are similar things for diesel engines, a little bit less common, but if you had a diesel generator, and many of the big commercial businesses would have a diesel generator, you can get microbial growth in the diesel tank. So basically a biological growth in the fuel, and there's some biological effectively disinfectants to disinfect the diesel, and then the filtering system will take that out. But one of the leading causes of diesel generators in commercial businesses not working is a mass of diesel bug, which is a microbial growth in the tank, growing in there. And then you start it up, and the diesel generator runs for a few minutes, and a big glob of this stuff goes through the line, plugs up the filters, and then the generator stops running. So if your generator at a commercial business is not being maintained properly, this kind of thing usually infects those generators over the course of 3 or 5 years, and they're just not reliable when you go to use it. So hopefully places like hospitals and our government and so on are very aware of this and have maintenance contracts and people going out and servicing their generator a couple times a year. But if you know of places that have a generator and haven't serviced them for 5 years, chances are they'll probably start up and then quit in about 5 minutes and it won't work. Another fuel that you can run generators on is propane. And propane, of course, comes in tanks and more commonly known as a fuel that you might have on a barbecue or perhaps an RV if you have one. The same little Honda generator can be converted or even purchased to run on propane. And this means that you're not storing gasoline as a fuel. Propane is very stable in the tank over time. It's a gas, which is all very similar in nature and will not separate. And it basically can keep forever in that tank. There are various sizes of tanks, from very small tanks that are portable up to very large tanks. Of course, some of the larger ones you might use in a rural area. If you can't get natural gas, you might have a propane furnace or that sort of thing. So there are various sizes of propane tanks. And if you happen to have a barbecue or an RV already, this can be a very handy way to fuel a generator, because you may already have a propane tank that you can use, and it's not, sort of an additional can sitting around in the garage. Generally speaking, propane doesn't have an odor off it when it's stored in. And just as a side note, you should generally store propane tanks outside. Gasoline tank cans probably should be stored outside as well, but it's very common to have a small number of gasoline cans in your garage. Of course, none of this should ever be stored inside your house. The propane tank, if it gets too hot, can release its fuel. And of course, that's not good. That's why you might want to store it outside. And you also have to protect propane tanks from the shining sun. They are pressurized inside, and they normally have 100 or 150 pounds of pressure. But you can, if the sun shines directly on a propane tank in the summer, it can cause more of the liquid in the tank to boil off and raise the pressure inside. And while there are relief valves to release it, probably won't become dangerous. You wouldn't really want a propane tank spewing propane out in your backyard. So typically, if you have these, keep them under shade, in a little shelter, or under a tree, or under your patio. Propane tanks should always be oriented with their valve up. And just a little picture on the left is there liquid propane and vapor in the tank. So the tank propane under pressure is a liquid. And when you draw off vapor, which goes into the barbecue or the generator, it evaporates from the liquid. So it's effectively boiling, just like water in a pot. Obviously, it occurs at a different temperature. So the safety design of the tank is to release vapor, not liquid. So you should always store a propane tank typically upward with the valve up so that it can release properly. And a 20-pound propane tank, which is the type you might have with a barbecue, fits really nicely in a milk crate. Works great if you need to draw one around in your car. You'll note that the bottom of a propane tank is pretty small relative to its size. And if you're moving them around in a car, if you have an old milk crate, you can drop them in and it gives you a little extra safety. And I talked a little bit here about heat and sunlight, and try to keep the tanks below 120 Fahrenheit. Generally, that's not a big problem here in Seattle, except for direct sun shining on the tank. Wind energy, obviously popular, and solar. We see this commonly with people who are doing off-grid RVing. It's very easy now to have a couple 100 watts of solar panels, charge controller, and then you can charge the 12-volt battery in your RV. So you can be an off-grid camper in combination with your propane tanks, which are on the front of this trailer underneath that black canopy, or underneath the black cover. You can use propane for cooking, and of course have your lighting needs and water pumping needs met with solar power. And of course, on homes all around the city, we're seeing solar being installed. Much of this is grid tied, meaning that the solar connects to an inverter, the inverter connects to the electrical grid, and if it produces electricity beyond what you're needing, it shoves it into the Seattle City Light grid for someone else to use, and the meter turns effectively backwards, and you get a credit for generating more than you used. One of the newer things is to include batteries, and you might have heard things from companies like Tesla selling their Powerwall. And these are batteries that you can have, and the inverter is a little bit different with that design, and it can be used as a generator for your house. So the solar panels charge the battery during the day and can provide power for loads. It can either be used at a time when the electricity is expensive, although we don't tend to have expensive electricity here in the Northwest, but in California, this is a thing. The time of day pricing of electricity in California can be upwards of 30 cents per kilowatt hour. So you might use the self-generated power during another time of day to offset cost. But here in the Northwest, most probably people would be putting a battery in to keep the refrigerator running or to keep lights working in their house if there was a power outage. Solar is neat, but wind power, of course, is also used, and a sailboat is the finest example of it. But we often see sailboats that have little generators on the back, little windmills. And these are a small scale electrical generation that you can use to charge batteries. So a sailboat will typically have some sort of diesel engine down below if it needs to maneuver at low speed. But when it's sailing along, it needs to keep house batteries charged. And there's not a lot of surface area on a sailboat to put solar because, of course, you have to walk all over a sailboat as you adjust the various sails and ropes. So they tend to favor these small micro turbines on sailboats, and they use these to charge the battery so that they can keep their GPS and radios and other things operational on a sailboat. If you've got a cottage or other small operation and you were interested in having a little wind power to charge a battery, these can be wonderful little things to charge a battery at your house or cottage and have a source of electricity. Of course, our ham radio friends are kind of interested in using these things to charge batteries to keep their ham radios working if the power went off. And then finally, wind power can also be scaled into different directions. Over on the right-hand side of this slide is a vertical micro turbine. Now, this is not really large enough to provide meaningful power for a house, but can be used in places for remote instrumentation and weather stations and that sort of thing. And on the left is an example of a communications site. This was a radio-oriented group that I first presented to, and it's common in remote places like mountains and whatnot to have solar and wind working together, because of course, if you have a day when it's overcast and the sun is not shining, quite often that comes with stronger than normal wind. And of course, the other advantage is that wind can blow 24/7, but certainly through the night when solar is not producing. So in some of these remote installations, it's common to have a micro turbine or two and combination of solar panels to bring in both the solar energy when the sun is shining, but to also be able to produce electricity when it's an overcast day and when you might have a bit of stormy weather with strong winds. And that brings us to the end of my formal slides. Happy to have a little dialogue, and I'll stop the sharing and wonder if there was any questions along the way. I want to encourage you to ask and give me feedback on what you thought.
Great presentation, Randy. Thank you.
You
Okay,
probably
so I'm back on in the very beginning, the telephone poles.
Sure.
So if they don't have the cross thing or whatever, then it's if that pole is down, that's just going to be that neighborhood. And if it has a cross thing, it might go up 3 towns up.
Yeah, yeah, that's a pretty good way of thinking about it. So if you're on a street that doesn't really lead to anywhere else, you might just see a one wire on the top of the pole with one insulator and then another wire on the side partway down, and then a bunch of telephone wires.
Mhm.
That's just a single circuit wire. It probably feeds 100 or 200 houses. The crossbars mean that it has 3 phases. Our electricity system normally has 3 phases, and to deliver large amounts of current, you would see those crossbars. And then if you're nearer substations, of course, you're going to see poles, maybe even on both sides of the road, that have 2 crossbars. And a lot of it is how close you are to the substation and what part of the distribution is, and also ultimately towards the edges of the network, the amount of current they're delivering. If it's serving a shopping plaza, office building, hospital, you're going to see those larger crossbars with big heavy wires on them. And if it's running down a single dead end street to a dozen houses, it's going to be on the lighter end with a single wire probably.
Mhm. Yeah, it's probably more contained. Okay. Thank
Mike,
you.
you had a question?
Randy, I wonder if you could talk about the lines that come into Seattle. For example, the lines that bring the power in over the Cascades, and just exactly what kind of, and where is the redundancy and all that, where we might lose power in Seattle because Bonneville's transmission lines go down in a terrible snowstorm or an avalanche or that sort of thing.
Sure. I'll share the slide where I had that little map. So on the left of this slide is an outline of the city of Seattle with shoreline and Burien and so on. And the yellow lines are the interconnection to BPA. So at the top and the bottom, so there's a line at the top that goes to the Bothell substation. And then at the bottom, that line, the yellow line from Creston Nelson, continues south to a substation where it interfaces with BPA. So this is the Seattle City Light system in this map. And then they interface in 2 different places to BPA. And I don't have a map of BPA's network, but BPA has lines across Snoqualmie and north as well. They are redundant, meaning that there's more than one set of lines. and they can independently switch those lines in and out of service. So if a tree fell on them or something like that, took one line out of service, they can reroute. Does that answer your question?
Well, I was just wondering what the level of redundancy was, whether or not we are, for example, bringing power in from the Skagit in one area and perhaps maybe some BPA coming over the pass and something else coming up from south. In other words, how many different circuits do we have coming into the Puget Sound area?
Right. So that's actually at a BPA level, and I unfortunately don't have a BPA map handy. But if you the Google terms you would want to search for are BPA transmission map. Oh, okay, there we go.
Yeah, I shared that in chat.
So that's wonderful, and that's actually their GIS map. So part of this shows quite a lot of distribution towards the coast, but generally speaking, the Columbia River is the primary source of generation. So in the Washington state context, a lot of our power is generated in the middle where the T and the O and then the word Washington are. And then the Columbia River, of course, runs down towards Portland and then out to the river. So those lines, maybe you could just zoom in on that. And I think we can see that there are 3 or 4 lines crossing the mountains in Washington.
Yeah, and those are mostly 500 kV, I think.
Yeah. Very high tension lines. And the southern ones come into Covington area, and which is south of Kent and east of Tacoma. So that sort of point where several of the lines come together is a BPA area in Covington.
Yeah, so that line connects over to Ellensburg to Schultz substation.
Yes. And then there's obviously a northern line that comes in sort of to Everett, and you can see where there's a blue line that kind of just ends in Bothell. And that was at the north end of the map I showed with Seattle City Light. Seattle City Light has an interconnection in Bothell. And I believe that the transmission lines from the Skagit may well be part of the BPA grid. I don't know that they're owned by, I don't know that the transmission lines are owned from Skagit all the way to Seattle. But certainly Seattle City Light has the capability to put power on the BPA lines up at the Skagit, transport it to Seattle, and let the electrons flow. So I lived in the East Coast back in 2003. And of course, in 2003, we had a very large power grid outage affecting New York and Michigan, Ohio, and Ontario. And ultimately it was caused by a tree contacting a line, shorting it out in the control system, not actually identifying that fault and isolating a section. And it ended up having a cascading failure where the power outage cascaded through Ohio to Michigan to Ontario to New York. And we were down for several hours. Some parts took a little bit longer than others. But this mode of operation, when you lose power completely in a grid and have to restart, is called a black start, meaning that you're starting from nothing. Black in the electricity business means the light's not on. And what they had to do in that case was to disconnect all of the loads at the substations and then gradually bring on generators that had a black start capability, meaning that the generator could start and had what's called an exciter that works without external power. And they typically, a grid operator will have a few of those in the grid. They restart the grid, and it took approximately 24 hours to restore the electricity across that wide area, because they had to generate a little bit more power and then connect some load and generate some more and connect some load. You couldn't just connect all the generators and make them run at full tilt. You had to actually match the demand from users with the generation. So on one hand, it was a sad thing to see that happen, and we all had our lives interrupted. But on the other hand, it was reassuring to know that they did actually work and they knew how to get things working again. And it wasn't, in the big scheme of things, not having power for 24 hours wasn't the end of the world. my sister lived on a farm, and we ran over to her farm and helped with the generator to water the animals, and that sort of thing. But perhaps one of the biggest things that I learned from that were, wow, do I ever appreciate traffic lights that work? And getting across a large city when their power outage occurs and there are no traffic lights turns a commute that might normally be, some number of minutes or hours into just an exceedingly long time. And the number of people that understand that when the lights are out, that it's a four-way stop seems to be a very minimal thing. So everybody's always in a hurry to get somewhere. So if you can imagine your commute through Seattle and all the traffic lights you hit, and then you imagine the power being off and them not working, you're just not going to get anywhere fast when the power is off. Now with LED traffic lights, it is possible to have battery backup now on traffic lights, but to the extent that the city has implemented that, or not just the city, but even the state, I'm not sure. So the cool thing is highways like the I-5 and interchanges work just wonderful because they don't depend on electricity. So if you're ever caught in a situation where a wide-scale power outage, you need to go somewhere, don't be afraid to take the interstate highways or those large highways that rely on and off ramps. They tended to move pretty quickly. But city streets, even those thoroughfares like, our Aurora or others that are multi-lanes wide, those things just come to a grinding halt without traffic lights. Further questions, comments, discussion?
Randy, I love this. I'm going to tap you off the on the side about I'm super interested in getting power out of our car batteries. Being able to charge our cell phones is great. I know how to do that. I've got the device to do it, but I'm looking at bigger things. Weirdly, I went from charging a cell phone to motorized wheelchairs, and that's, one takes very little power, the other one takes immense amounts of power. I'm trying to figure out what's in the middle there, like CPAP machines, or I'm thinking medical devices. What are our neighbors going to need that we can maybe help them with off of our car batteries?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting construct. The electric car industry is still very new, and they're still trying to solve just the basic transportation issues. There's also safety concerns because, of course, most of the batteries in the electric cars are wired together in a way that the voltage the car uses are, 400 volts or 600 volts, relatively high voltages for people to be plugging in and not plugging in things. So most vehicles have an auxiliary battery, which provides, a regular 12 volts, just like your regular old gasoline car. And they have a capability to charge cell phones and smaller loads. But I think what you were alluding to, as soon as you get to larger loads, the auxiliary battery capability is not really designed for a huge amount of current, even though you might have the transportation battery that moves your car with a lot of power. That auxiliary circuit is somewhat limited in the amount that it can put out. It gets pretty specialized. And when you start thinking about a $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 electric car, you don't necessarily just want some Joe working on it and wiring things up because you've got a warranty to think about. So I think we're kind of limited to what vehicle manufacturers are going to provide for those really higher current things. I think the solution for an emergency is, there in any sort of widespread emergency of the type that we often plan for in Seattle, we're going to expect widespread infrastructure failures like a loss of power. And I think we're probably just going to have to set up a community center as a place for people that have medical needs, like machines that they have to keep running. I think that if you think about the logistics, for example, of distributing oxygen to those that need oxygen, it would be far easier to have them all moved to a community center where all the people that need oxygen can get it in one place, because then you could have a truck that comes every few days and replenishes some large tank. And the distribution and logistics of, say, oxygen in an emergency could be much easier if you can get all those people to kind of one facility. Similarly, CPAPs, all those other things, you may end up having a community center that is set up to provide those special medical needs during an emergency. And yeah, they're getting to be very common, that we see many people living with oxygen as a therapy they have continuously, and living in their homes now with conditions that maybe 30 years ago was not that common.
Right. Randy, actually, I'm talking, I haven't even looked into like charging my cell phone off of a Tesla. I haven't even gotten that far. Somebody asked me the other day, I'm like, I don't know, I haven't even started. I'm talking about just regular gasoline powered car
yeah,
batteries.
With
okay.
regular cars, yeah. 12
Yeah.
volts, you have a ton of options.
Well,
It's
you've got a fair bit
Yeah.
of capability with a car, in that, you know, your car in your driveway with a full tank of gas is a very powerful emergency machine, because you've got a lot of energy in the tank. It's not particularly efficient to run the engine and idle it. I mean, it's not necessarily great for the environment, but if your choice is freezing to death inside your house or sitting in your driveway and running the heater to keep warm, there's probably a choice there that you want to make, and you can start the engine and warm things up. Similarly, your car has an alternator on it, which charges the battery. Those typically have enough to run some small appliances, and you could have an inverter, which attaches to the battery of your car. And you could make a little bit of electricity, sort of along the lines of that Honda generator I showed you. So you could use your car as a generator, but it's going to be relatively inefficient on fuel compared to having a proper generator. On the other hand, if you need to charge a cell phone, you've certainly got a cigarette lighter outlet, several USB outlets in a newer vehicle, and maybe even a convenience AC outlet in some of the fancier cars. I had a Honda Pilot, and it had an AC outlet in the console with a little tiny inverter, so you could even recharge your laptop.
yeah.
So
If
Randy,
you're just
what
charging
I'm,
a phone, you could just.
Oh,
run
you've
it
got the
through,
battery jumper cables right there.
yeah. So
Okay.
take the
I've got an
battery out of the
inverter.
car.
Sure.
Yeah. And so you could, this one has a cigarette lighter on it. You use a cigarette lighter thing. So I can charge computer electronics or whatever off of USB, but directly off my battery. So I'm not turning the key on the car. I'm not energizing the car. But my mother-in-law just went home from the hospital the other day on an oxygen concentrator. So I think that's the device I'm going to tackle next. Because I get what you're saying, Randy, and it makes perfect sense to centralize all those folks that have medical needs. But we're looking at the first shelter being set up by the city 7 days after the earthquake. Our concern as hubs is always day 0 to day 10. So, how can I help my neighbor who's stuck at home or stuck in their neighbor's house that's on an oxygen concentrator? Can I, take a car out of a battery, go inside with it, and help keep that person alive until they can get to a shelter or some kind of facility?
It
Yeah.
would
So,
probably
I-
not run very long on a battery out of a car.
Yeah, you
They
might
don't
get a couple
have
of hours
huge
and then-
amp hour capacity.
yeah, that's what I haven't figured out yet. Are we talking 2 hours? Are we talking 2 days? I don't know.
Well,
I think
have
when I
a
looked into
CPAP.
it, it would be a couple of hours for an oxygen concentrator.
Really? I didn't think
Yeah,
they took
on
that
a
much,
car
but
battery,
okay.
because they're not designed to provide energy for more than a few seconds. They're just designed to start your engine. If you had some
Yeah.
RV batteries that you could connect and parallel and charge, you could use those, but then you're gonna put extra load on your alternator. So it's
Yeah.
probably best to get a dedicated pack like an EcoFlow Delta if you want to run it inside.
The big challenge is that the battery backup options for these things, or the car charger options, are usually a thing you have to buy. So if the person hasn't bought that thing, you may
Yeah.
not be able to connect it. I have a CPAP myself, and I like to go camping, so I ended up having to buy the 12-volt battery power supply that goes with my CPAP brand. So I've got this, one that I use all the time in the house, and then when I go camping, I got the one that clips on the battery, right? And it does take quite a bit of power. Like, it's good for, I think a smallish car battery was good for like 1.5 nights or something, and I had to recharge
Yeah.
it. So yeah, you pretty quickly get to the point of needing a generator. And I totally get what you're saying, though. The city not setting up a shelter for 7 days. I actually, maybe I'm a little bit odd, but my guess is that the community will just get around and do it ourselves before we actually wait for the city. That's not a slight against the city, but I think the demands on the city are going to be so huge, and their ability to operate without communications infrastructure and without really having all of their full staffing and transportation working is just going to be so compromised. I think we just end up taking logical decisions as a community and implementing things, and just use our network of who knows who to open up shelters and facilities and make things better in the community inch by inch over the coming days.
You are preaching to the choir, Randy.
Yeah,
We're always thinking about how to make things work until the city can get their feet underneath them.
yeah. I mean, they struggle in the best of times. They operate so close to the line that even the best of times, the response times and everything else are hard. So I think it's important for the community to be able to self-organize and just figure those things out. And it might be rough and ruddy, and it might not be a really great situation, but that might be something that you can get done on day one, so that the day 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 is taken care of until something more fully comes along.
Yeah. Well, and Matt's putting in a backup a battery powered generator, which is great. The thing is, I'm not going to buy, I don't need one for my family. It'd be nice if the folks that have the oxygen concentrators or the CPAP machines or the, whatever, there's probably a million medical devices out there I don't even know. It'd be great if they had the batteries, but these are folks that I think are struggling to just put food on the table. They're not going to have, an extra $200 or whatever. So I'm trying to make use of the power that we have, and I guess I'm bumping up against the power of a car battery.
So I think the best option. I know my aunt was on one, and I think that the solution she had was just to have oxygen bottles as backup. She had several days worth of oxygen that she could hook up tanks.
Yeah.
To get if the power went out.
That's assuming your insurance company will pay to have the extra ones there. And again, it's only a couple days. It's not, it's not the 2 weeks you're going to need until you can get to a shelter. But I'm just exploring options.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing to deal with by any means, and many of the people that are on medical treatments like that are probably not working. They're probably going to be on some sort of fixed income and limited means. So
yeah,
they're worrying about getting through the next day all the time, and they're not necessarily the ones to have generators and things like that.
Yeah.
But there will be a lot of cars with batteries just sitting out anywhere.
Yeah,
I know.
So it's not a bad idea to pursue, because there'll be a lot of batteries.
That's how, that's what I think. I have 2 cars sitting in my garage. They're not going to do anything for me.
If you were to hook this up to your car and run the engine 24 hours a day, then this would power it. That you could use that as a high power generator that would.
I guess
would
if
power
I had a
concentrator.
full tank of gas, I could run my car and charge somebody's battery off of it.
Yeah, if it was an emergency and it's a situation where somebody's life is in danger. Yeah.
I'm thinking that one of the best tools you can have is a siphon hose for gas, because when we can't get gas at the gas stations, we'll be running around the neighborhood for the abandoned cars to get gas to run our generators.
Yeah, but
You really
since
can't siphon them.
you can't siphon out of you can't put a hose down in, there's a block to it. They did that a long time ago.
Yeah, the best way to do it would be to unhook the fuel pump and use the fuel pump to pump the gas out into another container.
Do I need to find the directions on how to do that? And we'll include it in our book.
That'll be the deep dive. How to
There's
steal
got to be
fuel
at least
from
10
an
YouTube videos on how to do that.
Yeah. How to steal gas. I'm going to write that
Find a truck.
Well, and it's also important to recognize that if you're dealing with a hybrid car, you can't use that 12-volt battery for much of anything other than a really minimal, because the 12-volt battery is not charged by the gasoline engine. It takes its charge out of the traction battery, and the traction battery doesn't get recharged unless you're driving the car.
Gotcha. So it runs down fast.
So you can you can find that you have a 12-volt battery in your hybrid car that is sitting there almost empty and you didn't realize it.
Wow. This is
Well,
so complicated.
electric
You do have the
cars.
luxury of shopping for cars with power, though. If you're looking at EVs, there are a number of cars that have V2L capability, like the Hyundai Ioniq 5, the Rivian. Those have high power AC output. It's not very common, but some cars do have that. So if you're looking around, that's a consideration.
So if you're gonna get an electric car, shop smartly, I guess.
Yeah, I think the Kia
But-
EV6 has it.
Okay.
The Honda generator is about $1,200. So that's not, when we start talking about electric vehicles at $30,000, $40,000, $50,000.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in the market for a car.
Yeah,
Yeah.
if you're gonna replace your car anyway, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some of the newer Ford pickup trucks have a very high powered generator option that you can buy. So you can imagine that a number of contractors buy pickup trucks for their business, and rather than having a generator as a separate device, you can get a 5,000 watt option with a Ford pickup truck. The hybrid option can be extended to include a 5,000 watt generator that's big enough to run electric saws and that sort of thing. So if you're lucky in your neighborhood, and there's a few contractors that have bought their fancy Ford pickups, you can tell because after the power outage, they'll be running in their driveway with a big heavy black cord to the back of their truck.
Right. Wow. Ugh.
And for electric cars, they are, I mean, in Japan, you can buy from Nissan a device that plugs into the car, and you can have power come out of the car, and it's converted to, their standard for AC power. So you really couldn't use it in the United States, but I mean, it is technically possible to go both ways on cars, and that's one of the pushes that is out there within the Electric Vehicle Association, is to have automobile batteries, car batteries, for electric cars become sort of a buffering device, a storage device across the a network, by being able to go both ways in and out of it.
Yeah,
Well,
they
one of the
do
things
store a
we-
ton of energy.
One of the things you could pursue maybe as part of emergency hubs is all of the fire stations in Seattle and mostly in the region have diesel generators at the fire stations. And they're of course designed to keep the fire station operational. If for those people that have critical emergency devices or medical devices, obviously, the first place they're going to call if they have a medical emergency is Medic 1, and that comes out of the fire stations as well. So possibly as part of the extension of the hub work, maybe there is a model where there's kind of a community partnership, and maybe the fire department would consider housing those people and giving them an electrical outlet, because in a very large scale emergency, the fire trucks are not going to be in the stations. The garage bays are going to be empty. They're going to have electric power because their generators are going to be running. And I'm hopeful that those fire stations have been built pretty solidly and are going to survive. So they may end up being our neighborhood facility that has literally the lights on, and becomes the aid place.
You want to check with the city fire department as to whether they'd be amenable to that.
But yeah, that was the context of what I was saying. is
Yeah.
through the hub organization, approach it from the standpoint of how's the best way to handle these? Because ultimately they're going to get the call anyway if something goes wrong. And if you've got a whole bunch of people that are reliant on medical devices and only have a few hours without it, there's probably some logic in having them in a place where it's easier to care for them.
So a couple of things. I think that is kind of in the back of the mind of the firefighters, that they go out and fight fires, and then when that kind of stuff is taken care of, they revert and they become like a first aid station. A while back, this was pre-COVID, a bunch of the hub captains met with their individual fire department, fire chiefs, I don't know what they're called, whoever whoever's in charge of all these different stations. And I remember talking to the one that's closest to us. They had like 2 days worth of gas on hand. They have a tank in the ground, so they can, I'm not even sure the pump to get the gas out of the ground into the generator or into the trucks. I think that's electric powered. So I think that's an issue. And there was like 2 days worth of gas there. So where they go to fill up for gas is, I'm on the northeast side. They go all the way to the northwest side, and that's where their reservoir of gas is. So they're not, I was really surprised, but they're not set up to be self-contained, to be self-sustaining at the fire department. Maybe they've got a plan to commandeer gasoline from the closest gas station or something like that, but.
So you can't actually count on gas stations working because very few of our gas stations have generators. And as you noted, the gas is actually below ground. Most stationary generators at places like fire halls run off diesel, and they typically have what's called a day tank on the generator, which provides a few hours of running. And then an auxiliary tank, as you noted, could be buried outside. So the generator starts up and runs off the day tank, which is a fuel supply close to it. And then once, of course, the electricity is being generated by the generator, the electric pump in the remote tank can be started and it replenishes the day tank. So this is pretty common in buildings in the downtown area where example, you might need an auxiliary power supply for fire suppression. Really tall buildings have additional booster pumps in them. Some of those run off of diesel. So that they typically telephone central offices. In a critical emergency over several days, the federal government gets involved in resupply of diesel fuel. The diesel fuel in our area is generated most commonly from the refineries, which are Whatcom County or north of us. And there's the Olympic pipeline that carries the fuel south. It goes down the east side of Lake Washington, comes to Renton. And then the terminal that we get most of our gasoline and diesel fuel in the Seattle area is at the Port of Seattle. There are some large tanks there, and the Olympic pipeline fills them up. And then the fuel stations all around the city are delivered by truck out of the terminal. No one's told me this, but I would guess that in the event of a very large earthquake, we can probably just write that fuel terminal off because the whole entire port is built on reclaimed land. And I would guess that we're going to be pretty annoyed at the outcome because I would expect that the fuel tanks are probably floating in Puget Sound, and there's probably oil and diesel fuel spread all over, and it's one heck of an environmental mess. So I believe that in the event of a large scale emergency, either the state or the federal government is going to put on tractor trailer sized fuel trucks to draw directly from the refineries up north into the Seattle area. And of course, there'll be a priority allocation scheme. Hospitals, government facilities, and so on will get the diesel fuel. Our local filling stations are probably not going to be replenished. Obviously, if they have a tank in the ground with fuel and a generator to get it out, that would be a wonderful thing. But generally, priority allocations of fuel will go to government facilities and emergency facilities. There's also a fuel tank facility at SeaTac Airport. That's normally oriented, of course, toward jet fuel. So at the south end of the airport is a series of white tanks, really large tanks, and those hold fuel for the airport, refueling of planes, and that again comes out of the Olympic pipeline. One could guess that a pipeline buried in the ground is perhaps likely to be interrupted in a large-scale earthquake. So whether that pipeline continues to move fuel or not is uncertain. The Olympic pipeline continues all the way to Portland, and Portland has a similar tank farm in an industrial area of the city built next to the river. And they recently did a study, a seismic stability study, and sort of predicting the outcomes down there. It was oriented more from an environmental standpoint, and they're expecting that any sort of seismic event would cause an environmental catastrophe in the river. It's just a series of bad news when you start to so fuel is going to be a problem. The government facilities are going to naturally have fuel resupply contracts, And pretty quickly, as soon as they call an emergency order and get higher levels of state and federal government involved, they'll use those levels of government to reach out to industrial resources like the refineries, determine what fuel they have on hand. They'll organize, commercial tanker drivers to go up there. And of course, if they need to get an escort on the highway or need to clear the highway, they'll get WashDOT involved in the Washington State Patrol and whatever else to give them an escort and go up and get diesel fuel and start resupplying hospitals and whatever.
And like you mentioned, the jet fuel could probably be used in a lot of diesel generators as a
Yeah,
emergency.
jet fuel is very common, very commonly used. For example, our military uses jet fuel in almost all of the portable engines and vehicles and trucks. So that when the military is working in some far off place fighting a war, they don't want to have 3 or 4 different kinds of fuels that they have to carry. So they generally use military jet fuel in most of their big diesel trucks for the Army, as well as Humvees and all of that. So yeah, fuel is critical in emergency. That it's part of one of the emergency service functions. And priority for our hospitals and things like that naturally occur. Of course, you won't be able to go to the Home Depot and rent a generator when you need one. And the big thing is as soon as the power goes out, things like the credit card terminal at the gas station no longer works. So even if the gas station is one of the few that has a generator, that's when you open up that little envelope you keep in the safe spot at home that's got $500 cash, and you go down to the gas station and get your 20s out and pay for the gas, right?
Yeah. I think this is common knowledge. I don't think I heard this in a place that I can't repeat it, but I'm fairly certain the mayor's office has a paperwork ready to go that as soon as there's an emergency, they, the mayor signs this, throws it on somebody's desk, and has commandeered all the gasoline in the city. You won't be able to fill up your own car. I think that's the case because they're commandeering it for emergency vehicles. I don't know how they implement that, but
So it'll just have to happen in the summer.
Well,
why is that, Patty?
Well, so it's not so cold, so we don't
Yeah.
freeze that, But I guess I was going to say also, maybe the pharmacies, if it's not a major earthquake or whatever, if we're just talking mostly the power grid, maybe the pharmacies would be set up with all the generators and stuff. So if people have medical machines they need to hook up, that might be a local place to go.
That's another deep dive for another night, Patty.
Yeah.
Cindy's
okay.
finding out a lot of interesting stuff about pharmacies.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're all on our own. Okay. Then, all right.
Well, we'll have to keep an eye as well, because certainly all of the government levels are focusing on electric vehicles. And I know that the city, for example, has a beginnings of an electric fleet with goals to ultimately have widespread electrification. So I'm not sure how you power or recharge a fleet of police vehicles in the future when they're all electricity, but presumably some of these facilities will end up having to have very large diesel generators to make electricity to power the cars.
Yeah, or they'll all be solar powered and wind powered.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the opportunity to present.
Thank you,
Nice
Randy.
to meet a bunch of you, and very wide-ranging conversation. But I think these are the types of conversations that expose things and make us aware of all the infrastructure that we just drive by every day or walk by and don't give it another thought because it's so reliable. Nice to meet you all.
Very true. Thanks, Randy.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.